Kenyon, right? Kenyon Sam is a writer, nationally acclaimed performance artist and activist from San Francisco. Her new published book, Sky Train, Tibetan Women on the Edge of History, with a foreword by the Dalai Lama, reveals for the first time the untold narrative of Tibet from the perspective of its women. Blending memoir and oral history, the author travels on China's controversial new Sky Train to Lhasa in 2007 and crosses the Himalayas in search of women from an earlier oral history project. This groundbreaking book reveals gripping stories of women's resistance, courage, and spiritual resilience in the 50 years of occupation, and gives one of the first inside accounts of the recent and drastic changes in Tibet from the perspective of the Tibetan people. Kenyon spent a year in Tibet and Dharamsala when Tibet first opened in mid-80s. Consequently, she became a Tibet activist in the US, helping found the Tibetan Nuns Project, doing grassroots organizing and speaking before Congress for the Tiananmen Square hearings to link human rights in Tibet to that event. SkyTrain began as an oral history project, was over 19 years in the making. I give the mic over to Kenyon, please.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to follow Betty, because I've always loved her poetry, but it's the first time I've heard her prose. Let's see. I have some images, and I might do a little reading too. As Tupton said, I started. I first went to Tibet in 1986 when it opened, and the first day I was there, I met the only Tibetan in town who spoke a little English. And by the second night, her mother had invited me to live with their family. So I was Chinese and going to be, in China for a year, but I ended up really spending the whole summer in central Tibet and trekking on the land, and then eventually gave up on China. I did try to like China, but I just left and spent the fall in Dharamsala. So a few 2 or 3 years later, I went back to Dharamsala after His Holiness won the Nobel Peace Prize, and during that trip, I started collecting oral histories of Tibetan women. For a number of reasons, only 2% of the literature was about women. I was also living in the government compound and realized at the time, this is 1990, there were no women working in the offices, the government in exile offices, and so forth and so on. Most of you probably know they're not that prevalent in the religion. So I became curious about what their experience was. I didn't feel that it could be assumed that their experience was the same as men. So it started out as a curiosity about that, especially March 12th, which was a Tibetan Women's Uprising Day, which was a big march through Dharamsala every spring. And when I followed them to the rally, there wasn't any literature, they couldn't really tell me exactly what it was. So anyway, I ended up spending several years collecting about 36 women's interviews all over Asia and the West. And in this book, SkyTrain, just came out a few months ago, I've put in the 4 most powerful that represent different aspects of the last 50 years. One woman's story represents the invasion, and one represents the occupation, one represents resistance, and one represents exile. So I think I'll go ahead and maybe go through the slides, kind of just a few slides, kind of briefly, and then I'll read a very short page or two. So this, of course, is the iconic view of the Potala. I took this in 1986 from Chakpuri Hill. The Lhasa Valley is surrounded by mountains and also cut through by the Kaichu River. It's got the most days of sun. It's something like over 300 days of sun or something, of anywhere in central Tibet. And as you can see, the Potala dominates the landscape. And on the buildings, all the buildings in town were generally about 3 stories high or so. You can hit the next one. And this is the Yarlung Sampo River. This is taken right next to sort of Yarbulakong, the first temple, and what's called the Valley of the Kings, where Buddhism first entered Tibet. So this is also from 1986. When I was there were very, very few cars, hardly any cars, barely had electricity. Like most houses had like a 40-watt bulb in some of the rooms, and it was some of the hours of the day. So the air was very, very clear. There wasn't any manufacturing or, factories or anything like that. Next. This is the 3rd highest mountain in the world, Gangadunga Mountain. So this elevation is about 11,800 where Lhasa is, and the average elevation in Tibet is 15,000. Okay, next. So this is the Jokang temple. It's the holiest of all the holy temples in Tibet. It's in the center of Lhasa. This is from 1986, and what I remember, I was never interested in religion or Buddhism or anything per se, but what I remember about this time, and I really didn't know that much about Tibet. I wasn't one of these people who had read every book about Tibet in my teenage years or anything like that. It was just kind of one of my many stops that I was interested in seeing, when I toured China for a few months. And then I was going to spend the other few months teaching English. But what I remember seeing was that the pilgrims, were in front and prostrating over and over so that the stone was like slick and shiny. So we're talking centuries of, prostrations. So I just remember that there was a incredible faith that I could see in the people, even though I didn't know really anything about Buddhism or the principles or anything, or the philosophy. Next. Okay, so this is just a map that shows the Beijing to Lhasa Railroad. And next. It goes up, in 48 hours, it goes from Beijing to Lhasa, and it gets up to almost 18,000 feet, and then comes back down to 12,000 feet in Lhasa. And every train engineer expert in the world, Japan and Germany and Switzerland, recommended against building the railroad because it crosses 400 miles of permafrost, which is not stable, of course. It's thawing and freezing and so forth. But the Chinese devised a system where they put these rods in the ground that freezes them with this chemical or something. It's all in here. I'm sorry, not too good with the details and names. But there's lots of endnotes if you like research. So it freezes the ground, and therefore they built these pillars and put the train tracks. But what they didn't calculate was that global warming is happening faster in the Himalayas than anywhere else in the world. So by the time I was on the train, which was 7 months after it started, there were things that had already cracked, pillars that had cracked and bridges that were falling down. Next. So it crosses through the Changtang, which is the Great Northern Plain, the least populated part of Asia. It's bleak, it's full of wind and treeless and unpopulated. Next. You can't see this so much in color, but what they've used for the signage in the design motif for the signage in the trains is the design that's it's like a chocolate brown background, and then up on the top is sort of a brick red strip behind the white dots, and it's only used for religious buildings traditionally in Tibet, and they've used it as a design motif through the train. Next. And all kinds of fencing and a big construction footprint in the Changtang, which used to be quite pristine. Next. So these pictures are from 2007, so this is 21 years later. And you can barely see the